Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming here tonight and for being here for the fifth and final talk of the Spaces of Contestation speaker series. Before we begin, I'll just introduce the project generally and give you a couple of dates because we have a couple of events left in the project as a whole, so hopefully you can make them. Then I'll introduce Kirsty. But I was also asked to introduce an upcoming event that will be taking place here, and it's organized by the SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement. It's a Coast Salish singing and drumming workshop led by Russell Wallace, and it's happening on April 28th at 7 p.m. in this room, and it's free. So Spaces of Contestation Collective Walks is a project that was realized through Unit Pit Project's curatorial residency program, and I'd like to thank the staff and the volunteers and the whole center, and Keith Higgins particularly for their support and their help. So the project as a whole is a series of talks, performances, public actions, publications, and an exhibition that examines the collective walk, protest, or public demonstration as both a performance and as a social formation. The core of the project is in 4 collaborations between artists and community organizations and is meant to initiate community engagement and democratic use of public space via the realization of site-specific participatory performances. The participating artists in the project are Lauren Marsden, Didier Morelli, Gabriel Mendel Solomon, and the Unlearning Weekenders Collective formed by Zoe Cray and Catherine Gros. We've had an exhibition that has opened March 22nd and is ongoing, has been evolving since then. We'll be having the finissage reception and a panel discussion with the artists on Friday, April 18th. So this Friday, the panel discussion is at 7 o'clock, and the finissage reception is at 8 o'clock. And the exhibition is then running up until May 3rd. We've also had a series of site-specific performances that have started on March 22nd, and we have a couple of them, or 2 upcoming. So tomorrow there will be a procession led by Didier Morelli and a reception in the gallery in the afternoon. And we have the final Unlearning Weekenders walk, so the Unlearning Walking Club. And if you are interested in participating, I invite you to register online on the Unit Pit website. We're coordinating some carpooling, so we just need to know how many people are coming. Great. So the speaker series is organized as part of this project. Is meant to foster critical discussion around issues of urbanism, economy, community activism, and politically engaged artistic practice. The speaker series is co-presented with the SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement and the SFU Institute for the Humanities. And we're particularly thankful to the Institute for the Humanities tonight for their contributions to Kirsty Robertson's coming here from out of town. So Jeff Mann, Jamie Peck, Urban Subjects, and Stephen Collis were the first speakers of the series, and you can watch documentation of their talks on the Unit Pit website and on the SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement's website. So I'll introduce Kirsty, and then she will speak, and we'll proceed with a question-and-answer period after the fact. So Kirsty Robertson is an associate professor of contemporary art and museum studies at Western University. Her research focuses on activism, visual culture, and changing economies. She has published widely on the topic and is currently finishing her book, Tear Gas Epiphanies, New Economies of Protest, Vision, and Culture in Canada. More recently, she has turned her attention to the study of wearable technologies, immersive environments, and the potential overlaps between textiles and technologies. Her co-edited volume, Imagining Resistance, Visual Culture and Activism in Canada, was released in 2011, and her tri-authored volume, Putting IP in Its Place, Rights, Discourse, Creativity, and the Everyday, was published in 2013. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for having me and inviting me to come to this series. I'm really thrilled to be a part of it. And as it's the end of semester, I thought I'd do a paper that has a lot of bells and whistles in it. There's a lot of examples, and it's presented something like almost a manifesto. It's probably a lot more strident than I would normally be. So I'm just putting it out there, and I'm welcome your comments at the end of it. So in March 2009, the Art Gallery of Ontario in downtown Toronto reopened after an extensive renovation undertaken by Starchitect Frank Gehry. The reopening was celebrated with a fundraiser titled Massive Uprising. The party began with riot police greeting attendees at the door. Once over the threshold, the courtyard of the gallery was lit in deep red, highlighting the protest signs strewn about the place, which said things like, "Fight for your right to party," and "Join the uprising." The tablecloths were covered in graffiti and the bar in camouflage. Yoko Ono and John Lennon's Bed-In was restaged in the middle of the dance floor. On that night, as partygoers traipsed amid fake riot police and hipster hippies, sipping capitalist cocktails on Moscow mules, and nibbling treats off napkins where the A in the AGO had been turned into an anarchist symbol, it might seem as if the co-option and corruption of protest was complete. So here, radical protest was neither scathingly critiqued nor dismissed. Rather, an image of 1990s anti-capitalist protest was pasted onto 1960s counterculture, communist revolution, and anarchist uprising, and then translated into a successful corporate fundraiser for the arts. And it remains unclear whether the planning was shrewd or cynical or completely oblivious. So an extreme example for certain, Massive Uprising demonstrates a relationship that is often assumed between the art world and protest. Museums and galleries are places where protest goes to die. As Kirsten Folkert notes of the institutionalization of tactical media, the interventions take place elsewhere, and the gallery space is for contemplating the evidence or results. Gavin Grindon agrees. Writing of activist art exhibitions, art that is socially critical, engaged, or activist is only so within invisible but strict, institutionally defined limits. Such art might mimic the practices or raise the issues of activism, but it does so in a context without consequence. Susan Buck-Morss agrees, describing museums acting anesthetically on political art, quieting its impact. In general, there is agreement amongst critical scholars that authoritative museums and galleries act vampirically, encouraging the creation of subversive work, sucking the active opposition out of it, and leaving an empty shell that nevertheless conveys a sense of edginess upon the institution. There are countless examples to support these claims, some of which I'll outline in this talk. But I think there's a tension here that often goes unnoted, which can be summed up as this. If authoritative museums and galleries are impossible sites for the staging of radical acts and interventions, if they are places where political art is inevitably co-opted, why is it that they remain such enticing locations for performing activism? Why was it that the PR company behind Massive Uprising felt that there was a comfortable enough relationship between museum and protest action to stage a parody as the opening for the new wing of the museum? Why is it that curators and artists try to stage interventions even when, in the past, such interventions have often been described as failures? Why do activist interventions often choose authoritative museums and galleries as the site for their actions? So here's an example that I think sums up both the potential and the pitfalls of radical intervention in the gallery. In 2003, Mohawk curator and scholar Richard Hill's exhibition Meeting Ground opened. The exhibition was a rehanging from an Aboriginal perspective of the uber-traditional and parochial historical Canadian collection at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Meeting Ground radically unsettled the curatorial norms of the museum, which focused on the display of works by mostly white, male, English, and French Canadian painters, organized in a linear chronology. So the AGO had proposed adding certain contemporaneous Aboriginal carvings to the display of Canadian art. And this is typical of the way that Canadian museums have dealt with the complete absence of Aboriginal cultural production from their collections. So this is actually a picture of the National Gallery of Canada, and it shows how this kind of thing happens. So regalia has been added to the Canadian collection in glass cases in front of it. And interestingly enough, almost none of these objects actually belong to the National Gallery because they weren't considered art, so they were instead collected by what was then the Canadian Museum of Man. So Hill proposed something else, arguing that simply adding objects did nothing to address the ongoing legacy of Canadian museums' complicity in cultural genocide. Further, he suggested keeping the carvings, masks, and other objects in glass boxes imprisoned them and maintained a continued separation from the paintings hanging on the walls. He proposed curating the collection from a Plains Cree perspective. So here's what the galleries looked like before. In 2003, before the rehanging. They have dark walls, they have paintings organized in chronological order. So 3 images that are fairly typical. And here's what it looked like afterwards. So it's a little hard to see in this image, but the ceiling and the floor are quite important. So the exhibition is divided into 3 levels: the sky world, the earth world, and the water world. Indigenous knowledge and objects were paired with traditional objects from the Canadian collection so that each told a story. For example, the Madonna statue was now across from the Thunderbird, which you see here. They were in conversation. So this conversation or meeting ground was essential as it avoided both ghettoization and victimization. Here the playing field was completely leveled. There was now no way to proceed through the Canadian wing without confronting Aboriginal presence and a paralleling of the building of the nation of Canada with the continuance of Turtle Island. In doing this, the exhibition, though on the surface about updating the Canadian collections, broached much larger questions about the legacy of residential schools, land claims, and repatriation, as well as the absence of Indigenous culture and viewpoints in general from Canadian institutions. The exhibition also included extensive educational programming, storytelling, meetings with elders, performances, dances. It was immensely popular and received rave reviews in the comments books. So though there were no protest actions per se, Meeting Ground was the culmination of years of advocacy and consensus building. And to my mind, it was one of, if not the most important exhibitions that took place in Canada in the first decade of the 21st century. It was successful in completely undoing rather than reversing the power structure of typical displays in Canada. But here's the problem. You'll find almost no information about this exhibition, aside from a short piece written by Hill himself. Meeting Ground was supposed to be permanent, or at least semi-permanent. But when faced with a sharp decline in tourists following the SARS scare in Toronto in 2003, the Art Gallery of Ontario shut the doors to its Canadian wing in order to save money. After a public outcry, the group of 7 paintings were brought downstairs, where they were again accessible to the public. Meeting Ground stayed behind closed doors and was then dismantled after the museum received a massive donation from the Thompson Foundation, which allowed them to move ahead with the Frank Gehry expansion that was the reason for the massive uprising opening. So along with monetary donation, Thompson also contributed on permanent loan a significant chunk of his art collection, including a Rubens and a large number of paintings by well-known English and French Canadian painters, among them Cornelius Krieghoff and the Group of 7. Currently, the Thompson collection of traditional Canadian art hangs on white walls in the center of the Canadian wing, while circling around the Krieghoffs and Jacksons like a donut, Plains Cree and Blackfoot curator Gerald McMaster's hanging of the Historical Canadian Collection does use some of the twinning strategies developed by Hill, so thematically positioning a work by an Indigenous artist next to a complementary one by an English or French-Canadian artist. But the radical act of reversing the viewer's positionality, as you can see in the slide, it's much more typical, so that radicality is gone. So what this says to me is that there was a brief moment in Hill's exhibition where the AGO became the site for a powerful reimagining, literally another world that was possible, if only for a time. Importantly, part of the success of Hill's project lay in the fact that it tackled the status of the museum as part of its action. Keeping this in mind, I wanted to look at another example of the museum itself trying to stage a political intervention, and this one I see as much less successful than Meeting Ground. In May 2007, the G8 met in Rostock, Germany. Although there were significantly less than the hundreds of thousands of protesters who had gathered against the organization's meetings in Genoa in 2001, activists nevertheless congregated in large numbers to resist the G8's position on asylum seekers, profits before people, climate change, debt reduction, labor standards, and numerous other issues. At stake was the very idea that the G8, as progenitor of a capitalist system that brought about the above-mentioned inequalities, could lead any kind of change at all to the system that it had produced, and from which the 8 industrialized countries were benefiting. This time, however, activists gathered in the spa town of Rostock and nearby Heiligendamm were greeted not only with barbed wire fences and the forces of security, but also with a large-scale and well-organized public art intervention titled Art Goes to Heiligendamm. According to the curator, Adrian Gohler, Art Goes to Heiligendamm was concerned with moving art outside of the traditional display locations and into the public space, through which activists and police, as well as negotiators and government representatives, would be moving. The text on the Art Goes to Heiligendamm website suggests that art has the potential to intervene, not just in public space, but also in the minds of those visiting, offering a series of sophisticated encounters with the issues raised by the social movements present at the site of the meetings. Gohler describes contemporary art as having a responsibility to spread information about global issues and politics. As politicians and media have become indifferent, she concludes, artists have taken over the task of listening, observing, and releasing information about micro and macro events. 40 artists and cultural producers were invited to the exhibition, and some of them, such as Martha Rosler or Ursula Beeman, contributing work that was already well known in political art circuits. Other works were created specifically for the exhibition, including the centerpiece, Collective Round Labor's Silver Pearl Congress Center and Spa, a temporary installation that echoed some of the architectural and other features of Hotel Kempinski, where G8 negotiations were concurrently taking place. The Silver Pearl was meant to create a space where activists and visitors looking at the art could take a rest, engage in debate, and eat. It was a forum and a sleeping place, and the locale for the alternative summit. While Silver Pearl clearly articulated the goal of the exhibition in building bridges and undermining binaries, other works were more direct. Torbjorn Ruder Christensen installed a box in the center of town the exact dimensions of isolation cells used to contain illegal migrants. At 4.5 meters square, noted Christensen, the cell is significantly smaller than the space allotted by German law to domestic dogs. Other works dealt with surveillance, asylum, religion, and of course, protest. Throughout the town could be found Julian Roeder's photographs of ultra-globalization activists, Jules Spinacha's photographs of the police at protests, and Kai Wiedenhofer and Sebastian Bullock's films of protesters. So right now, these are the images from the artworks, whereas the actual protests looked more like this, with police chasing protesters out through the town's surrounding fields and protesters trying to block access to the site in Rostock. Thus, it should come as no surprise that Art Goes to Heiligendamm was often accused of having been organized by the G8 itself to try and placate or trick those visiting the site into non-confrontational tactics. In fact, the exhibition was organized independently, though with the approval of summit organizers, so it was not a guerrilla intervention. It was instead associated with the G8 Alternative Summit and numerous NGOs and political speakers and theorists, such as John Holloway and Vandana Shiva, and others whose names would have been instantly familiar to many of those engaging in direct action. But it was the case that the exhibition was presented under the slogan, quote, "Art to the rescue," exclamation mark, and had as its express purpose the de-escalation of tensions between activists and security, rather than, for example, presenting activist aims to the negotiators. As a press release for the exhibition stated, quote, "We want to contribute to de-escalation on site. Thus, we want to break with the logic of participants and opponents of the summit and create a discursive space of experience beyond good and evil," end quote. In a biting critique of Art Goes to Heiligendamm, Kirsten von Stekemeyer argues that the exhibition could have been a chance to prove that political engagement in the cultural sector is important, not so much for the art's sake, but for the sake of fighting global capitalist policies, like those reproduced at the G8. Instead, the exhibition became less about radical action than about the potential of art to enter new arenas. For von Stekemeyer, the role of art in this context was one of appeasement and of undermining the goals and aims of the social movements it purported to celebrate. Von Stekemeyer was not alone in her assessment. Holy Damn It and international artist collectives refused to participate in the exhibition, preferring instead to continue independently with their project 50,000 posters against the G8. 10 artists and groups produced posters that were handed out for free at the demonstration and other venues such as youth clubs, universities, bookstores, and bars, and sold with profits gathered to fund the legal defense of arrested protesters. As Holy Damn It member, well-known filmmaker and artist Oliver Ressler puts it, "We realized that they were not interested in discussing the problematic political aims of their project with us, and so we decided to make our contrasting political agenda public." Ressler contrasts his experience at the protest in Rostock and Heiligendamm with a visit to the exhibition. "My experiences were so intense and rich during the week I was there that I did not want to spend time visiting a show like Art Goes to Heiligendamm." For Ressler and Holy Damn It, a third way between the negotiators and protesters was impossible. Instead, Art Goes to Heiligendamm instrumentalized and functionalized art in order to legitimize the G8 and by proxy to allow for intimidation and defamation campaigns organized against activists, leading to the escalation of police presence at protests and the prohibition of rallies in the city at the time of the meetings. Outside of the context of Rostock and the protests that were taking place there, Art Goes to Heiligendamm is, to my mind, an important political exhibition with an ethos very much like that of the Insight series of interventions that have taken place along the US-Mexico border. Many of the works were politically effective, and many did strategically undermine any claims the viewer might have had to a lack of action based on ignorance. But here is the tension. If shown in the museum, Art Goes to Heiligendamm might have been a successful political exhibition, but it would equally have been undermined by the institutional logic of containment that I've already outlined in the museum. However, putting a political exhibition into a situation where people are actually protesting does not make it any more effective. All that occurs is that the actual embodied activism is contrasted with a visual echo. This exhibition might be seen as quite different from the overtop parody of anarchists and hippies in the massive uprising opening, But ultimately, many critiques of the exhibition do return to a notion that political art is for entertainment rather than change. So the central tension presented by Art Goes to Heiligendamm can be found in one of the art posters that adorned lamp and information posts in the town, marking the directions between exhibition sites and ostensibly furthering the goal of bringing the exhibition into the public space. One of the posts was wrapped in an enormous black poster on which was written the words "No G8" in yellow below a title, Art Goes to Heiligendamm. As thousands of protesters gathered in the streets with very real concerns about the G8, and as riot police chased them out of the town center through the fields surrounding Rostock, one wonders at the viability of a political position being used as advertisement for an art exhibition. Does this mean that the statement "No G8" is a political position, or is it an artwork? Can it be both? The use of a political slogan in this context is a little absurd and functions as a way not of de-escalating violence, but of rendering it as a performative action undertaken for no particular reason. What Art Goes to Heiligendamm did, inadvertently or not, was to stage the protest itself as a massive art installation outside of the space where the real negotiations and the real power was located. The lack of museum walls did not really matter, as they were present symbolically, if not physically. So to conclude this section, the first half of the paper, I do think that radical interventions are possible from within the museum, as is the case with Meeting Ground. But they require absolutely a refusal to see the museum as a neutral space. Artists such as Hans Hacke and Andrea Fraser and Fred Wilson understood this in using institutional critique to question the neutrality of the museum. But combining a complicated and often expansive cause, such as indigenous rights, labor issues, anti-capitalism, environmental protection, with institutional critique is remarkably difficult. But to do otherwise really does seem to result in all issues being neutralized, disempowered, or aestheticized. This isn't really surprising. Over the last 15 years, authoritative museums in the global north and beyond have become, sometimes through no fault of their own and sometimes voluntarily, increasingly complicit with capitalism, tied to the whims of funders, forced through funding cuts to rely ever more on the private sector. Museums are often described as the beacons of new capitalism. A global city is nothing without a Frank Gehry, a Daniel Libeskind, a Zaha Hadid gracing the skyline with its titanium curves. And the combination of increasing needs for corporate sponsorship, museum boards composed almost entirely of members of the 1%, for lack of a better term, and an art market tied to investment opportunities makes authoritative museums and galleries seemingly hostile environments for staging any kind of anti-establishment action. What is perhaps more surprising is that given this, people still try, and they try often, and they try a lot. To this point, I've talked mostly about interventions organized by curators or artists from within the museum. In the second half of the talk, I cross the threshold to the streets outside. So there's history here. In 1969-1970, the Art Workers Collective in New York City picketed a variety of museums, but focused on the MoMA, eventually pressuring the institution to implement a free admission day, to pay attention to the number of women and artists of color in the institution, something that's still deplorable, but at least now no longer goes unmarked. But in addition to the democratization of the museum itself, the Art Workers Collective put pressure on museums in New York to protest the U.S. participation in the Vietnam War. In October 1969, the Art Workers Collective organized a successful moratorium of art to end the war in Vietnam. The MoMA, the Whitney Museum, the Jewish Museum, and a number of commercial galleries closed for the day. The Metropolitan and Guggenheim refused, but even there, the Met postponed an opening, and the Guggenheim became, by process of elimination, an excellent location for a vibrant vibrant picketing session. Examples of protests crossing the thresholds of galleries abound from the 1960s on, but I thought I'd take an example that's a little closer to home from the nearby Vancouver Art Gallery, whose public spaces, I'm sure you all know, have long been used as a site for protest actions, speeches, and more recently, occupation. We're going back to 2002. In June 2002, Places of Their Own, an exhibition of work by artists Emily Carr, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Frida Kahlo opened at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Organized by the McMichael Canadian Collection of Art in Kleinburg, Ontario, what had been planned as a fairly minor exhibition quickly grew in size and scope, benefiting significantly from the growing popularity of the three artists. Canadian rock singer Bryan Adams had recently publicized his interest in Emily Carr, although admittedly this was in part because he was auctioning off his collection. And a biopic of Kahlo had recently been released, bringing with it public attention to the fact that Madonna was the owner of the largest collection of Kahlo paintings outside of Mexico, and incidentally, she refused to lend her paintings to the exhibition. The organization of Places of Their Own was deeply imbricated in the politics of the moment, in large part because the actual gathering together of the works required government intervention, timing, and money. The exhibition received help from unnamed people at high levels in the Canadian and Mexican governments, and can be seen as a clear act of cultural brokering. That is, the use of culture to smooth political or economic maneuvering. Keeping in mind that Places of Their Own was organized in the years just after the signing of the NAFTA free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, the exhibition was seen by government officials as an excellent way of conveying good feeling about the relationship between the three countries, in contrast with the worry and pushback against the economic agreement, with its potentially devastating effects on labor, the environment, and social programs. The touring of the exhibition coincided with what should potentially have been a celebration of the signing of the failed Free Trade Area of the Americas Agreement that had taken place only some months before in Quebec City and had been met with massive protests, some of the largest in Canadian history. Thus, in its initial imagining, Places of Their Own was obviously seen as a way to celebrate NAFTA in a non-controversial manner. The initial exhibition proposal suggests that one of the key messages of the show should be, quote, the relevance of a north-south axis to discussions of the development of modern art and cultural identity in North America, end quote. Over time, however, and even though at least in Canada, Places of Their Own was dubbed the NAFTA show, this element of the exhibition was pushed to the background while gender came forward. Much of the rhetoric around continent and nation were written out of the final exhibition, and instead the line, the drama, the passion, the estrogen, was one of the lines used to advertise the show. Sorry. While the essentialization of gender and sexuality for three women who were anything but mainstream in their lives and choices is perhaps questionable at best, it was certainly an easier option for the gallery. Although there's no evidence in the archive as to why a change from continental integration to gender took place, probably it's just that audiences would have been more interested. There is an interesting corollary to events taking place outside of the exhibition. As Places of Their Own was being installed, gallery officials became aware that a large-scale protest was being organized to coincide with the opening. Though not focused on NAFTA and other economic agreements controlling global capitalism per se, anti-capitalist, women's rights, and Indigenous groups were planning a welcoming party for then Premier Gordon Campbell, and might have been extremely interested to know about this alternate history of the Places of Their Own exhibition. On June 14, 2002, just before the exhibition opened, the following email was sent to staff of the Vancouver Art Gallery. As you know, this is a quote, as you know, the Premier will be attending the members' opening tonight to officially open the exhibition Carr O'Keeffe Kahlo Places of Their Own, and there will be protesters in attendance. Accordingly, we have added extra security staff, while the city police will provide an additional set of fencing and uniformed police. We also have contingency plans in place in the event of disruption. It is important to note that the G8 meeting of foreign ministers Wednesday in Whistler, extensive protests were predicted. In fact, the protests were small, very peaceful, and not disruptive. We expect a peaceful protest tonight as well, but are taking these measures as a precaution. Our position is that the gallery is an apolitical institution that acknowledges and respects different points of view. The gallery supports freedom of expression and has always encouraged open dialogue about art, culture, and ideas. Public programs will be distributing flyers to protesters, inviting them to visit this exhibition and view the work of 3 women who were, in fact, radicals in their time. On June 15, 2002, former mayor and then Premier Gordon Campbell arrived at the Vancouver Art Gallery to open the exhibition. His visit was greeted by protests that certainly were not the peaceful ones hoped for in the Vancouver Art Gallery email. Instead, myriad groups showed up, using the exhibition opening as a chance to address severe cuts to social programs that had been made by the Campbell provincial Liberal government. Within the hours of the evening of June 15th, the intersecting politics of art, market economics, and culture were laid bare in a manner that certainly surprised those attending the opening. In an article written in the aftermath, Vancouver Sun reporter Michael Scott described the event, and I'm pretty sure that this was Kathleen Bartels, the director, the very first thing she did at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I think she'd been there for 2 weeks. So VAG director Kathleen Bartels was experiencing a hostess's nightmare last Friday. Her big summertime party ruined by uninvited guests, armed police threatening to use pepper spray, the guest of honor too frightened to show his face, when she turned to a bystander, smiled unexpectedly, and said, quote, "This is what art is about," end quote. Turning the situation into a comedic performance or happening, Scott took Bartel's comment as a reminder that, quote, "good art is always a variety of protest," end quote, essentially flattening her ironic praise of the protesters into a comment about canonic aesthetics. Bartels quipped that she was happy so many Vancouverites would come to the gallery to express their opinions, but noted, "It's just unfortunate that people have chosen to disrupt what was supposed to be a celebration for the whole community." The reasons protesters might have had for showing up are largely ignored, or perhaps in the 2002 atmosphere of BC politics, they're just assumed as already known. Scott's report continues. As art openings go, this one was a definite typhoon. 2 people were arrested, platform guests, including news personality Gloria Makarenko, were roughed up, and mild-mannered art patrons had to fight their way past the commotion in order to look at the paintings. On the night in question, a number of anti-Campbell, anti-poverty activists came to the opening, many of them dressed in costume. A group of 5 artists, dressed identically as Andy Warhol, circulated through the crowd, passing out leaflets entitled 5 Reasons BC Artists Don't Like Gordon Campbell. Others were dressed in gorilla masks in honor of New York-based Guerrilla Girls feminist collective, one of whose members uses the pseudonym Frida Kahlo. As members of the art gallery, many of them actually had legitimate invitations, thus blurring the conventional line between who is allowed in and who is kept out. This is one of the few times that protests cross the threshold of the gallery steps into the space inside, and 150 protesters were able to enter without invitations, even as police set up barricades outside, ostensibly to keep the protest out, particularly of the reception and speeches that were to take place on the gallery steps. Uniformed and mounted police, plainclothes undercover officers, private security guards, Canadian Security and Intelligence Service agents, and the Premier's security detail were all on hand when a, quote, well-dressed young man in his 20s, who was actually anti-poverty coalition activist Ivan Drury, climbed on stage, pushed news anchor and MC Gloria Makarenko out of the way, and called for demonstrators to pull down the barricades outside. The heavy podium overturned, the young man was tackled, handcuffed, and taken away. Security shut the doors to the reception, whisked the premier away, and refused to allow anyone wearing a mask over the threshold. Scott describes the strange scene as he watched VAG volunteers walking down the line of people waiting to enter the gallery, telling them they would have to take off their masks, while protesters walked down the other side, handing out leaflets, encouraging people to keep their masks on, and shouting shame at the police, volunteers, and security detail. As protesters began to shake the barriers, police threatened to use pepper spray. Reported widely in newspapers the next day, Reed Urchuk noted, quote, "For the first time since his coronation as Emperor of BC, Gordon Campbell has been stopped from desecrating the memory of those three great artists, and stopped from reciting some cliched statements celebrating the marriage of art and capital in the form of art tourism," end quote. The insurrectionary anarchists of the Coast Salish territories who had organized the event recast it by noting that the choice of venue, an opening of an exhibition of feminist and revolutionary artists, was, quote, "an insult to everyone living under Campbell's policies." Bringing together a number of groups, including the insurrectionary anarchists, the Vancouver Anti-Poverty Committee, the BC branch of the Guerrilla Girls, the newly formed Andy Warhol gang, who were actually dressed in pictures of soup cans with signs on their back saying Campbell's Cuts instead of Campbell's Soup. It was intended to draw attention to the fact that Campbell had recently cut support to women's centers while also slashing funds to many social programs directly affecting women, artists, and the underprivileged. So a passerby asked, quote, "Was the fence there to keep the protesters out, or was it there to keep the art contained within?" Art critic Robin Lawrence picked up the same theme in the Georgia Strait's coverage of the exhibition. Throughout a fairly typical review of the exhibition, detailing the reasons given by the gallery for the display of three women's art, which included a notion of nation detached from the old world, female identity, sexuality, place, spiritualism, and so on, Lawrence intersperses first-person reminiscences of her encounter with protesters at the gallery. Included in the article in italics, Lawrence documents the odd juxtaposition between the exhibition's lack of politics and the protesters gathered outside. Quote, "A crowd of protesters carrying banners, posters, and large papier-mâché puppets marched past the VAG's Hornby Street entrance, past the long lineup of invitation holders waiting for admission, then massed in the plaza on the Robson Street side of the building. Spurred by the news Premier Gordon Campbell would be a guest speaker at the opening, they waved placards denouncing the provincial government's social education and healthcare policies. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace." Campbell's speaking, she notes, was inappropriate. For one thing, Frida Kahlo's best friend was Leon Trotsky. She did identify with the situations with the indigenous people. All of these women were outsiders and they were artists, and he doesn't represent that. Not outsiders or artists or women. And as Irchuk observed, as befitting an evening where power would be overturned, the atmosphere was carnivalesque in the sense that Mikhail Bakhtin used the word, a ritualized celebration, an inversion of the social order full of mocking laughter designed to uncrown power. While power might have been temporarily uncrowned, but it's the glee with which commentators, spectators, artists, and activists, as well as the director of the gallery, brought together art and politics that suggests that there is a great deal of potential here. Though it died down quickly, there was a large amount of coverage of the opening of places of their own. Gordon Campbell left without making a speech, although granted, the cuts to women's programs were not immediately reversed, and his record did not improve on Indigenous issues. I brought this example because it took place only a few blocks away, but there are so many others, many of them exceptionally effective. One might look to the number of artists who recently boycotted the Sydney Biennale because of the Biennale's relationship to Transfield Holdings, a contractor for Australia's network of immigration detention centres. The boycott was successful. Luca Belgiorni-Nettis, who was both the chairman of the Biennale and director of Transfield Holdings, was forced to resign, and the partnership with Transfield was ended in toto. That happened like a week ago. Also, just last week, Gulf, the Gulf ultra-luxury faction, together with Occupy Museums, staged an intervention at the New York Guggenheim, protesting labor conditions on Saadiyat Island in the United Arab Emirates, where Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, a franchise of New York's Guggenheim, is currently being built. Activists dropped banners, rained down pamphlets, and posted a manifesto on the wall at the opening of an exhibition about the futurists. One of the activists noted, "I think the context is really appropriate because they, the futurists, talk about restructuring the universe. So clearly the museum is giving that some thought at this moment, and we want to talk about restructuring the universe without fascism and without slave labor." He said this while pointing to their own manifesto, which was nailed to the wall. It's really hard to see because it's written on silver reflective paper, but it starts out, "Is this the future of art?" Occupy Museums has also organized a series of small-scale actions and interventions aimed at drawing attention to the makeup of boards of museums and galleries. And they were also behind a recent protest of the Smithsonian's uncritical exhibition of drone aircraft. So incidentally, both the action at the Guggenheim as well as the one at the Smithsonian took advantage of the free admission days, which had been brought into being by the Art Workers Collective some 40 years earlier. So many of you might have heard of Liber8 Tate, which is the example I'll end with. It's a coalition aiming to liberate the Tate galleries in England from their reliance on sponsorship from British Petroleum, the energy company responsible for the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Liber8 Tate have engaged in 12 actions to date. Among them, a rereading of Hamlet, To BP or Not to BP, complete with costumed actors sporting BP ruffs. If you know the BP symbol, he's essentially wearing it around his neck. They've also done a performative rereading of the British collection at Tate Britain through rising temperatures and sea levels, an exorcism performed by Reverend Billy of the Church of Stop Shopping. They've released helium balloons with dead fish attached, imported melting Arctic ice into the Tate lobby, covered themselves in oil-like paint, and poured gallons of molasses down the stairs. Most famously, though, Liber8 Tate offered a gift of the blade of a wind turbine to the Tate Modern, and this last one I'll look at in a bit more detail. The 1.5-ton, 16.5-meter-long wind turbine blade was carried by activists into the turbine hall, which is the scene each year of the free, massively attended Unilever series of large-scale art projects. Ai Weiwei did one with porcelain sunflower seeds that were spread across the whole floor. From the Liber8 Tate press release, quote, "The blade, which for years generated electricity on a Welsh hillside, was renamed by the art collective Liber8 Tate as The Gift and installed in the main turbine hall of the former oil-fired power station. The group then wrote to Tate Gallery director Sir Nicholas Sirota saying, 'We think that it is a work that will fit elegantly in the Tate collection, a work that celebrates a future that gives rather than takes away, a monument to a world in transition. Resting on the floor of your museum, it might resemble the bones of a Leviathan monster washed up from the salty depths, a suitable metaphor for the deep Arctic drilling that BP is profiting from now the ice is melting. But it is not an animal, nor is it dead. It is a living relic from a future that is aching to become the present. In reply, Sirota thanked the activists for their unsolicited gifts and wrote, "The offer will be presented to our trustees for their consideration at their next meeting in September. I shall respond thereafter. In the interim, your project will be stored by the Tate." Tate has a policy that all gifts of artwork must be considered by the board. Eventually, the Tate decided not to accession the blade, which I think is really too bad. There are too few instances of galleries and museums archiving activist ephemera. The Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver actually has an archive of material gathered from a healing ceremony that took place there after the institution hosted the APEC leaders in 1997. A number of museums, among them the Smithsonian, the New York Historical Society, the City Museum of New York, the Archives of Queens College, and the Labor Archive at NYU, all collected the iconic cardboard posters from Occupy Wall Street. The Vancouver Museum has a fairly extensive collection of counterculture artifacts from the 1960s, and there are other examples. But for the most part, these artifacts are lost to time or collected by a series of alternate ad hoc individual collectors or tiny archives like the Interference Archive in New York City. To bring all of these points together, the question that I get the most, more than any other, is why should museums care? Why should the Smithsonian take a critical stance on drones? Why should the AGO rehang its collection from an Aboriginal perspective? Why should the Vancouver Art Gallery listen to protesters? And why shouldn't the AGO stage a bizarre parody of protest and counterculture for its opening? Why shouldn't the Tate accept sponsorship from BP? Sometimes this question is asked belligerently and sometimes sympathetically. Museums are contested spaces. There are many who would never cross the threshold, and many others who would defend that threshold to the end. But I think the question is actually a little misguided. Frankly, if my research has shown anything, it's that museums repeatedly try to deal with controversial or political material, and they regularly fail. How many exhibitions, like Places of Their Own, have smoothed the rough edges, avoided the controversial elements, ignored the politics? The few examples of this that really do work, like Meeting Ground, perform that dual task of unraveling the museum, even as they use or draw on its authority, usually asking viewers to confront themselves as they are mirrored or not by the institution. But most often, museums are ill-equipped for the kind of multi-scalar interventions seen in Meeting Ground. Bringing together curators, directors, collections managers, fundraisers, and marketing departments behind this kind of exhibition is nearly impossible. I can't imagine that the curator of Places of Their Own was happy with the marketing department's focus on gender and estrogen. And I imagine that there are many people at the Tate horrified by the BP sponsorship, or closer to home, many museum workers unimpressed with the sponsorship of numerous cultural events, exhibitions, and now whole wings of museums by energy and mining companies like Talisman, Enbridge, and Encana. So maybe, perhaps, I hesitantly ask, is it productive when museums fail? Maybe it's better when authoritative museums take the money, miss the point, refuse to engage, because then there is a space that is created that is ripe for intervention. There aren't that many public places where radical discourse has a place. Newspapers have largely lost any kind of legitimacy as sites for debate. Protests are regularly violently oppressed. Gentrification has removed many public spaces, rendering them private and guarded. And if museums have a kind of presence born of a strange relationship between the mandate of the museum to be a public institution, its increasing turn to occasionally dubious forms of sponsorship and labor practices, contrasted with a history of art that assumes or even encourages dissent, why not make the most of this? While the Tate might accept Liber8 Tate because their actions are entertaining enough or arty enough to not really be a threat, That museum has also admitted that inquiries about BP and pressure to drop BP as a sponsor have skyrocketed since the Deepwater Horizon debacle. And as this is more than an issue of sponsorship, Liber8 Tate must be recognized for mobilizing a large number of mostly young people from a generation often assumed to be politically apathetic. Arguably, in this arena, Liber8 Tate has actually been more successful in their aims of encouraging action around climate change and resource depletion than have other groups demonstrating in front of more traditional venues, such as the BP offices. In short, while I'm not suggesting that every protest should take place at a museum, nor that every exhibition should expect or even warrant an intervention, protest has never been read as a part of or entangled with museum practice and policy, though its presence is near constant, and perhaps it should. A short epilogue. As visitors to the AGO's massive uprising wandered through the galleries of the renovated building, wearing artist Emily Shangar's Power to the People button, they may have wandered by the elevator, where event organizers had hung a stack of books in chains beside a poster detailing a list of censored books. They might have paused to glance at David Armstrong Six's installation, We Admitted We Were Powerless, or they may have stopped at the booth of artist Franco Mondini Ruiz, who used the event to comment on the tumbling art market and to liquidate at cut-rate prices his entire inventory in a performance entitled Morsels for the Masses, Populist Art at Popular Prices. As one reporter commented in the aftermath, reflecting on the presence of young students with their mouths taped shut and wearing T-shirts that read, "The worst part about censorship is," with the following words crossed out so you couldn't read it. "Don't worry, those aren't real protesters," the reporter commented. "They're part of the event." The AGO event was really a reflection of what does happen at museums as they cater to the wealthy patrons who must fund them. But not long after, it was the same museum that organized a series of projects with No One Is Illegal, worked extensively with street youth in Toronto, and participated in a long-term project with Regent's Park, a multiracial housing development on the outskirts of Toronto, fraught with questions about gentrification, belonging, poverty, and crime. Museums are complex institutions, entangled in the cities to which they belong, the global markets and politics that flow through them, and the multiple stories of their patrons, visitors, and workers. I think it's time to see and use them in that complexity. Thank you.